Welcome, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Ellen Wilson, and I'll be the moderator for this expert briefing for the media, which is hosted by the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. Today's experts will discuss methods to reduce climate-harming food waste and support sustainable production ahead of the quickly approaching holiday season. I'd like to briefly introduce our speakers. Roni Neff is an associate professor in the Department of Environmental Health and Engineering at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health and senior advisor at the Johns Hopkins Center for a Livable Future. She also co-directs the National Food Waste Research Network. Keeve Nachman is the Robert S. Lawrence Professor and Associate Director of the Johns Hopkins Center for a Livable Future. He is also Associate Chair of the Department of Environmental Health and Engineering at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. We will have time for questions following our speakers' remarks. We will take some that have been submitted in advance of the briefing and some from the Zoom chat. If you have a question, please enter it in the Zoom chat addressed to panelists and hosts. Please enter your name, media outlet, and question. We hope to cover as many as possible. Please note that participants are welcome to use images, video, or quotes directly from the briefing, and that the content is for immediate release. Participants will be muted during this briefing, and it will be recorded. Let's go ahead and start. Professor Neff, can you tell us why food waste is a bigger issue than just spending money on food that isn't eaten?
Yeah, thanks for that question. So the first thing I would say is that spending money on food that isn't eaten is actually not trivial. The average household spends about $1,500 a year on food that's not eaten. And that's actually, with the increased food prices that we're seeing now, it's probably even higher than that. And more broadly, we're throwing away nearly 2/5 of our overall food supply. And that's the equivalent of 149 billion meals. So that's just staggering. So let it sink in. So anyway, back to your question. So wasting all that food is wasting everything that went into producing, packaging, distributing, storing, and preparing that food. And all those resources basically never needed to have happened. So I'm going to throw more numbers at you, and I want to share them because they're quite striking. So we are allowing the equivalent of greenhouse gas emissions of 42 coal-fired power plants to be emitted for food that benefited no one in the United States. This is in the United States. And in fact, globally, wasted food is responsible for 8% of our total greenhouse gas emissions. And it really doesn't get that much attention, but it should. And then along with that, we're wasting or we're throwing out essentially enough water and energy to supply 50 million homes. That's 21.9 trillion gallons of water going into food that is wasted. And beyond the numbers, we're throwing out the hard work of farm workers and everyone along the supply chain that got the food to you, not to mention your own work in buying and preparing the food. And then especially at the holidays, many of us are motivated to reduce waste when we're thinking about the high rates of food insecurity in the US. That's 13.5% of the population. And globally, that's 2.3 billion people. But I want to say there's no direct pathway from our plates to someone else's. And we certainly don't want the message to be that we should give waste to people in need. But focusing on gratitude for our food can help us make less wasteful choices. And it can also help us think about how we want to work towards the policy changes that would lead to a food system where no one's hungry. And lastly, if you love food, you want to have the opportunity to enjoy it to its fullest rather than trashing it. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Professor Neff. Now a question for Professor Nachman. What are the implications of industrial farms and how can consumers make responsible choices?
That's a great question. So most of our meat, milk, and eggs come from large industrial farms, and the way we raise animals on those farms has serious implications for people, animals, and the planet. Thanksgiving time usually involves getting our loved ones together around a big meal. It's a terrific opportunity to explore food choices that support the types of agriculture that are better for public health and for our planet. Thankfully, we have a lot of options. For starters, we can rethink the idea of turkey as the centerpiece of a proper Thanksgiving dinner. I can't emphasize enough that there are so many plant-based options out there, and a simple Google search will lead you to countless recipe ideas that are delicious and less taxing on people and the planet. But for a lot of us, I know it can be really tough to forego the turkey for more sustainable options. So if turkey's got to be on the menu, consider giving it less real estate on your plate and maybe seeking out local, smaller farmers to buy your bird from. If you have to go to the grocery store because it's your only option, USDA certified organic turkeys can be a better choice. And it's really, really important to remember, while our food choices are so important, Thanksgiving can be a great chance to have conversations with our friends and family about the need for broader food system changes. And the most promising way to do this is to change agricultural policy. There are lots of reasons to rethink how we produce animals. Our current system is linked to environmental injustices, a huge climate footprint, and detrimental economic practices that hurt farmers and have important implications for public health. I'm looking forward to your questions and talking about this more.
Great. Thank you, Professor Nachman. Now we will take questions. If you have a question, a reminder, please enter it in the Zoom chat with your name, media outlet, question, and to whom you'd like to address your question. So let's take the first question for Professor Neff. How much methane is released by food in landfills in the US, and what effect does it have on climate change?
Yeah, great question. So first, why is methane so important? Methane's been called an emergency brake for the climate. And so it's key because it has a short lifespan and it's powerful. So when we cut methane emissions today, we'll see these powerful results within only about 7 to 12 years versus it could be hundreds of years for carbon dioxide. And given the climate impacts already happening, plus concern about tipping points, we need emergency brakes that can act quickly. So methane's a key greenhouse gas in wasted food. It comes from both food production and a lot also from food decaying in landfills. About 17% of US methane emissions are coming out of landfills, and that's emissions that we could have done a lot more to prevent. It's low-hanging fruit for addressing climate change. And I'll just say more broadly, food's a big piece of our methane, and it really doesn't get the attention that other sources do. Animal agriculture is even worse. That accounts for about 45% of our United States methane. It's the largest source. Good question.
Great, thank you so much. And here's a question for Professor Nachman. Can you say more about some of the environmental justice issues in food animal production?
Absolutely. And I think to start, I'm going to have to tell you a little bit about what food animal production looks like on an industrial farm. So we're talking about farms where we house thousands, sometimes approaching millions of animals in a single geographic location in confined quarters that are not exactly very hygienic and have very high stocking densities. And what happens is with the numbers of animals that you have in these facilities, you're generating a lot of manure that decomposes and releases all sorts of pollutants into the air, water, and soil. And so now that you understand what those operations look like, let's think about where they are. So one of the most important injustices comes from who lives near them and who works in them. So the people that have the most contact with that pollution, and the pollution can make you sick, are the people who work in those facilities and spend a lot of time there breathing the air. They rarely have the protective equipment that you'd hope someone who has that occupation would have, and they're at greatest risk of getting sick from chemical and pathogen exposures. It's also important to recognize that these operations tend to be clustered near communities where people live. And more often than not, especially in certain places around the country, those clusters of farms are near low-income communities of color disproportionately. So those folks bear more of the environmental burden, more of the pollution exposure burden than the general population. And lastly, when you go to the grocery store, we enjoy relatively inexpensive food compared to what the true cost that food actually is when you account for some of the environmental and human health damages associated with the way food is produced. Those pollution releases, exposures to chemicals and pathogens, they are not captured in the price tag. So we benefit at the expense of rural communities, and that's an injustice that really deserves attention.
Great, thank you so much. A question for Professor Neff. What can people do to reduce their own food waste? Are there tools that can be helpful?
Great question. So For background on this, consumers generate about 37% of the food surplus, and that's the largest group. And then second to that is actually consumer-facing businesses like retail and restaurants. So when we think about this problem, a lot of it is us. And many of us think, well, I don't throw out that much. And it may be little bits day by day, but if you add that all up and then think about, let's say you're cleaning out your fridge, cleaning out your freezer, it ends up as a lot. And in some of our surveys, in one survey, we found that 73% of Americans say that they waste less than the average American. But obviously, that's not possible. And multiple other surveys have found very similar results. So as we think about this, I think the first thing is to actually tune in to what is going into the trash and even write it down and track it. Because when you recognize what you tossed and what led to it, that's how you can come up with the solutions that are going to be most important in your home. And think about what we could set up in advance to shape our own environment and make it as convenient and natural as possible to not waste it and to, use it when we have it. Planning is the second thing. So these are like my top 5 tips. Planning would be the second one, really reducing excess purchasing, thinking about how much food you'll actually eat, how much you want to put on your plate. Check your cupboards before you go to the grocery store, things like that. Number 3 would be save your leftovers, label them, and be sure to also eat them and enjoy them. Like if you enjoyed them the first time, you'll enjoy them later. I love leftovers. Number 4, learn about the best ways to store different foods so they last a long time. Use your freezer. There's a lot of tips and tricks that I didn't know before I got into this, and that can be really helpful. And number 5 is learn about date labels. And there's a lot of misunderstandings about what date labels mean, and we need to like we're throwing out a lot of food as a result of thinking that it's not okay to eat when it actually is just fine.
Great, those are fantastic tips. For Professor Nachman, is antibiotic resistance something to worry about when we're buying our turkey?
It certainly can be. So antibiotic resistance is the notion that we're using antibiotics to raise animals for food, and those antibiotics are no different from the ones that we use to treat infections in people that are sick. And the worry is that by misusing them in animal agriculture, those antibiotics lose their effectiveness and bacteria learn to survive when the antibiotics are present. And the fear is that if we continue to misuse them in animals the way that we are, when a person gets sick and needs antibiotics to resolve an infection, the antibiotics won't work. And if the antibiotics don't work, it may mean delays in resolving the infection, which means more expensive hospital stays and more severe infections. And in some cases, we may really struggle to find an effective antibiotic to take care of the infection, and people can die. So in turkey production, there is a long history of using antibiotics in a routine fashion. So not in a context where we'd have, say, a veterinarian identifying a particular pathogenic bacteria in the turkey farm, but instead they just use them without a diagnosed condition in the turkeys. And that continual routine use just increases the risk of the development of antibiotic-resistant bacteria that could make humans sick and cause the problems I talked about before.
Great, very interesting. For Professor Neff, what should consumers know about food date labels?
Yeah, so as of now, there is still no federal standard on food date labels, and that's one of the big policy changes that we need. So, but there is a voluntary standard, and what it says, there's kind of 2 main labels, best if used by and used by. And the used by label, if you see that one, that's the one that you actually have to pay attention to and consider that like an expiration date. But all the other labels are basically quality labels. And the sell by label is something that's put on by the store to for its own internal purposes. And yet a lot of people, including people in my own household, want to throw out food based on that date, and it's meaningless. And these quality dates, they've done tests, like most people cannot detect the difference in the food before and after that quality date for quite some time because the people that are setting those dates want to set them early, as early as possible, so that there's no possibility that you're going to eat something and think it's not good and that's going to reflect badly on them. But the reality is you don't need to pay attention to those labels. You need to focus only on the use by labels.
Great, thank you. Here's a question also for you, Professor Neff, from Eduardo Cuevas at USA Today. How do you see recent food recalls, often from large-scale producers and fast food companies, in terms of safety for consumers and sustainable practices in food production? What steps should people take to make more safe, responsible choices for holiday meals in light of these recalls and outbreaks?
This is a great question, and I think I would actually turn it over to Dr. Nachman for the main response, but I also want to follow up. I'll just say a quick thing from the food waste perspective is all the food that we are throwing out as a result of a recall, and not just the food that we're throwing out as a result of that, but we often will throw out, like if the recall is of lettuce, we may throw out all of our kale and other leafy greens as well. All that is a form of waste. And so we really need to be thinking about how do we get in a precautionary or a prevention sense. What can we do to prevent the need for those recalls in the first place so that we don't have waste and we don't have the food safety issue? And with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Nachman.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Roni. I certainly want to echo your sentiment about prevention further upstream in the food system before we even get to consumers. But a lot of your audience is going to be consumers. And even outside of the context of a recall, there's some practices that are really important to keep people safe from some of the foodborne pathogens that we may encounter when we prepare and eat food. And so when we're thinking about meat, it's inevitable that you're going to find bacteria on your meat. That's under normal circumstances, even outside of a recall. And what you need to do to avoid exposure to those bacteria is follow food safety precautions. So when handling meat, you want to make sure you handle raw or uncooked meat separately from any other food that you produce. And you want to clean and sanitize the surfaces that raw meat touched before placing any other food on those. So really just designated area and materials to work with your raw meat, clean those thoroughly, and prepare your vegetables and other foods separately. Now, even with vegetables, and we've seen this with the recent E. coli outbreak in carrots, it's really important to take advantage of the steps you can pursue to avoid exposure to those pathogens. So we're talking about carrots. When we think about carrots, we certainly want to wash them, but peeling is another great option. So all the nooks and crannies in the surface of carrots, by peeling them, you remove those, and those can be places where bacteria can live and thrive. So that would be one important way to remove your exposure. Another thought too is that you may often buy produce from the grocery store. I buy salad greens all the time, and they have labels that say triple washed. Don't trust those labels. You really want to wash your own produce because that's just one more opportunity for you to remove bacteria that ultimately can make you sick. So by following those steps, even in the context of an outbreak, you have a dramatic reduction in your own risk of contracting those pathogens and getting sick.
Great. Can I just follow up one quick piece I just want to clarify what I said. So what I was referring to is the idea that we're often throwing out foods that are not the actual food that's being recalled. And that is unnecessary. So we should, like when they're making a recall, they're focused on, let's say, the lettuce, and you don't need to throw out the other foods that are similar to lettuce if that's not the recall. Just wanted to clarify that one.
Great, thank you. A question for you, Professor Nachman. You mentioned that USDA organic can be a better choice for people who aren't able to find a smaller farm. Why is that? And how can I figure out if my turkey comes from a sustainable farm?
It's a great question and one that requires a little bit of nuance. So USDA organic means very specific things. It's not a panacea, so it doesn't mean that the turkey has necessarily been raised sustainably. But what is important goes back to the question I answered earlier about antibiotic resistance. So USDA organic raised animals are not allowed to be fed antibiotics routinely as part of their regimen. And what that means is that those animals do not contribute to the growing issue of antibiotic resistance. And our research has actually shown that USDA organic labels are meats labeled with USDA organic certified labels are less likely to carry antibiotic resistant bacteria, which means that buying those meats as compared to conventional ones is a potential risk reduction for consumers.
Great, thank you. For Professor Neff, what are some particular things you think about related to food waste during the holiday season? You've mentioned a lot of these, but anything else to add?
Yeah, one of the big ones is that we have kind of what I would call a cultural trap, especially in the holidays. Many of us feel this need to put out an abundance of food. Like it's if we have too much food, it demonstrates that we care and we should never run out of anything. And so it's worth stopping and thinking about that and that there's other ways to show you care. And even that seeing all that food and knowing that a lot of it's going in the trash is actually more of a burden than a gift. And it's not what I want to be showing to my kids. So that's one piece. And then just on a more practical level, in terms of the holidays, if you've got a big gathering, there's some great online estimators that are out there where you can estimate how much food to buy based on who's coming, what are they, how big of eaters are they, things like that. And so it's good to do that estimation. And then put out a bunch of plastic containers or baggies with labels on them and let your guests take the food home is another good thing.
Great, thank you. Another question for you. What are
Mhm.
some policy opportunities for addressing food waste, Professor Neff?
Great. Okay, so one of the first one, as I mentioned, would be the food date labels, and then many states are passing organic waste bans that keep food out of the landfill and encourage donation and recycling. And recent evidence points to the idea that these need to be done well. They can't just like ban organic waste and expect it to happen. But that's if you say it can't go in the landfill, then people do find other ways to manage it and to, compost it if they need to. And then we need more funds to support and coordinate food donations and related infrastructure. There's a great opportunity to do this in the upcoming Farm Bill, which is long delayed, and we need to be, this needs to be passed. It's been a long time. Um, and then we need support for infrastructure, for composting and building markets for recycled organic waste. And it would be there's the Zero Food Waste Coalition has called for $100 million in annual appropriations and $20 million in mandatory funding to address these and other food waste needs. So I'd recommend looking at their website and the detailed policy recommendations that they have.
Great, thank you. And for Professor Nachman, just you have talked about this, but anything else to add about the foodborne disease outbreaks like Listeria and the E. coli and staying safe from the bugs when preparing Thanksgiving dinner and beyond? Anything else to add? This will be our
Well,
last question, and then I'll ask each of you to add anything else, any final thoughts.
not a whole lot to add. One thing maybe that's reassuring is that the listeria outbreak is pretty contained within deli meats, and most folks that I know are not having deli meats for Thanksgiving dinner. If you are having deli meats, pay close attention to the recall notices from the Food and Drug Administration. One of the challenging things about listeria is that it's capable of growing at refrigerator temperatures. So keeping it cool in the refrigerator is not going to prevent it from becoming more of a threat in those deli meats. But maybe deli meats aren't an issue for you this Thanksgiving.
Great. Okay. Thank you. Any final thoughts from each of you? I'll turn to you first, Professor Neff.
Yeah, thank you. Well, it's a pleasure to have this opportunity to talk about these issues and share about them. And, there's a lot more detail to all the things that I said, but I just want to emphasize from the consumer perspective, as we think about the holidays and think about the other 364 days a year, um, there's a huge amount that we can do, and a lot of it just requires paying attention and also, seeking out some of these tools and approaches that can help you prevent waste. And I should
Great.
say, you asked me earlier, there's a lot of
Yes.
online tools, apps, things like that that can really make a difference.
That's great to know. Professor Nachman?
Just two quick thoughts. The first one is I know it can be really hard to find a sustainably raised turkey. A lot of folks don't even know what that means. Ideally, what you're looking for is a turkey that's been pasture raised, so not confined in a structure its whole life, because the turkeys that are pasture raised generally are raised using practices that are less threatening to the environment and public health. The easiest way to identify a pasture raised turkey is to find a farm that produces one, ideally one that's local and nearby, one where you can talk to the farmer and ask questions about how the bird is raised. If you can't locate the farm, or speak with a farmer, it may be more likely that the turkey was raised industrially. So those are just helpful rules of thumb. The last point I wanted to make has to do with conversation. So Thanksgiving holidays are great times to have conversations about food and food systems and think about ways that our choices can play a role in changing what we produce and the way we produce it. And while our personal choices are super important, at the end of the day, what we should be pushing for is policy changes to really, really modify and transform the way we produce food, because that's going to have implications far beyond our own individual contributions. So thanks again for your attention in today's briefing.
Great, fantastic. Thank you to you both for your presentations and really insightful answers. We will email the links to the resources mentioned today and shared in the chat. And with that, I'd like to say thank you again to everyone for joining us today.